Before we begin, an important announcement.
I will now say some magic words. Slava Ukraini. And with that, hopefully I have your attention. The war in Ukraine is still going on, and like it or not, the Russian summer offensive is continuing. Ukraine defence forces on the ground need intelligence and mobility to stop them. That means they need 4x4 vehicles, and quite often those vehicles get destroyed, because driving up to the front lines to have a quick peek is, to put it mildly, bloody dangerous. The folks at Cars for Ukraine have asked me to help with getting the 48th Special Task Unit a 4x4 4 Recon as quickly as possible. If you think of the 48th a bit like the UK Special Recon Regiment or the US Rangers, you wouldn't be a million miles off in that they go up to the front, find out where shit is, and either take it out themselves or pass the intel back to other units for further action. They have to put their eyes on a target, and to do that, they need a vehicle. Every penny from this video then is going to go and help them to try and buy that vehicle, but it won't be anywhere close to enough. I'd love it if you beautiful humans could help. Only if you can, only if you've got the money. Don't spend cash you haven't got. But if you are able to assist, then together perhaps we can come a little bit closer to sending Putin and his arseholes back to the shithole that is Russia as quickly as possible. Thank you. Now, talking of incompetent fascists, let's talk about the Me210. Flying is, as humans have consistently proved through the centuries, very difficult. The great designer saw fit to equip the universe with gravity, which is great for, holding Jupiter and Saturn in orbit around the sun, or throwing pretty splashes of stars across the darkness or whatever, but it's much trickier then for those of us who are not ineffable and have to live on a rock to go about the business of getting into the air. So on the one hand, I say, you go girl, but on the other hand, us ground dwellers are forced to burn dinosaur juice, go really, really fast, and do a lot of complicated maths if we want to lift off the face of the ground and return safely to the Earth. This makes things great fun, but also difficult and unspeakably dangerous. Given the nature of the forces involved and mankind's ability to make deeply questionable decisions when under pressure, it's hardly surprising that the history of aviation is not just the history of great technical triumphs, but also of irredeemably bad aircraft. The basic bitch of bad planes are the ones that try and address a problem that doesn't really exist. For example, this thing. This is the General Motors Fisher P.78. About the best thing you could say about the P.78 is that it could fly. I mean, kind of, sort of. When it wasn't overheating or falling out of the sky or offending God and man with its ugliness. The P.78 was a terrible, massively expensive boondoggle, but the concept that lay behind it was perfectly logical when it was first dreamt up. Why don't we take parts from existing planes to keep production costs low, bolt them together like some kind of Dr. Frankenstein's monster, and build a super-fast, long-range bomber escort? I mean, that sounds great until you realise that the answer to a super-fast long-range escort is actually a decent drop tank on a P-47 or 51, not another kind of fighter. This is a kind of classic theoretical problem where an idea about how a battle's going to unfold hits the reality of how battle actually goes. Or, it would have been had the P-75 ever actually flown in combat, and no one at any point stopped and went, wait, what if we just made drop tanks? Because by that point they'd sunk millions into the plane and thousands of hours. Sometimes, of course, perfectly sensible aircraft can be kiboshed by good old-fashioned bad engineering. Take something like the Hawker Typhoon, for example. In theory, a replacement for the Hawker Hurricane with more punch, more flexibility and more speed. What's not to like? Well, as it turned out, the engine was shit at altitude and the tail kept falling off, leading to years of delay and loads of dead test pilots. It was finally fixed in the end, thanks to Winkle Brown and his massive testicles getting into it and figuring out what the issue was, after which it was actually a very decent aircraft which served for most of the war. When bad concepts meet bad engineering, you get a special level of rubbish, though. Take, for example, the turret fighter concept, so beloved of Bolton, Paul and Blackburn. The theory was multi-engine bombers would fly faster and further than their escort fighters could, meaning that they'd arrive over the UK on their own. If Peter the pilot could get up to them in time, he would benefit from having Gary the gunner in the back to administer a long burst of His Majesty's pleasure at Hermann the German's shiny bomber. But as we all know, that isn't how things turned out. In fact, German bombers were going to attack the United Kingdom escorted, and the turret fighter was as useful as empirical data to an anti-vaxxer. By the time that the Defiant turned up, fighters were faster and longer range than anyone had predicted, and putting a sodding great turret on the back of a glorified Hawker Hurricane meant a much more complex plane with crappy rates of climb, piss-poor straight-line speed, pants rates of roll, and much shorter patrol times, not to mention an ability to shoot forward. Plus, whenever one of these things was shot down, as they were in their droves, 2 aircrew got to die for king and country rather than just 1. It never really had a realistic chance of intercepting a bomber before the 109s relegated it to a piss-poor night fighter and target tug in the middle of 1940. And of course, bad leadership can make everything infinitely worse. See Trafford Leigh-Mallory's decision to prevent the Spitfire from being turned into a long-range fighter, or Ira Eker's continuation with unescorted daylight raids regardless of losses, or Hermann Göring's various plans during the Battle of Britain. Real crapness, true crapness, only comes to the fore when you bring together all three of these things. That is a concept that addresses a problem that doesn't really exist, mixed with bad engineering being pushed through by incompetent leadership. I like to think of this as the holy trinity of crapness, and there have been few crappier planes than the Me210 410. Between wars in the mad days of the late 1920s and early 1930s, the German concept of air fighting developed on a parallel but slightly different line to the thinking that was going on in, say, the UK or the US. As we've discussed before, the German idea of air fighting was to see their air force really as an adjunct to the army, essentially winged artillery, which could hit stuff dozens of miles behind the front line, but it would do so in direct support of ground troops. And to do this, they would need local tactical air superiority, so they needed a decent single-seat fighter, much as they had had during the First World War, and this was fine. However, as the 1930s rolled on, concepts began to shift, and potentially the Luftwaffe realised that it might need to send bombers much further, maybe even on strategic strikes, and to do that, they would need some kind of long-range fighter escort. It would need to be able to keep up with the bombers, it would need to have a similar range, and it would need to be able to fight in a dogfight when it actually got over the target and then get back home again. So not simple. In point of fact, this thought wasn't unique. If you look at, for example, the French, and once they got over their 1920s one plane to rule them all approach, covered so well by Rex's hangar, they'd had a similar thought, as had the Poles, the Czechs, the Brits, and the Soviets. All of them decided that some kind of, quote, heavy fighter, that means really one with 2 engines and some guns, was the answer, but none of them did it as well as the Nazis. A quick aside here. Somewhat inevitably, the Soviets also decided that they needed one of these, and so they turned to Andrei Tupolev to design one. He began work basically as the Bf-110 broke cover, whereupon Stalin had him arrested on the completely legitimate sounding grounds that he'd given the Germans the plans for the Bf-110. Suffice to say, of course, that he had done no such thing. Tupolev would then spend years designing aircraft whilst serving at the Secretary's pleasure, during which time he finished his Tu-2, just in time for the war to break out. Soviet aviation is, as Animaki can attest, completely wild. Tupolev wasn't actually cleared until 1955. In 1933, as Hitler came to power, the mad lads in the Reichsluftfahrtministerium started to warm up to the idea of a twin-engined heavy fighter that could be part escort, part tactical bomb truck, part recon plane, and part Nazi penis extension, and so they came up with a specification for a multi-purpose twin-engine heavy fighter that they issued out to industry. Scheiße, Kaiser, Bosch, thought the boys at the RLM, we've got a winner here, and indeed it seemed that they did. When presented with the concept by Ernst Udet, the Tim Nice but dim of pre-war Luftwaffe, Göring loved the idea. In fact, he needed new uniform trousers when he found out that Udet et al. Were proposing to call the concept the Zerstörer, or Destroyer, right up Göring's Strasse. And so it was in 1934 that specifications went to 3 firms, Messerschmitt, Henschel, and Focke-Wulf, to try and build the plane. Willy Vonkowaffen Messerschmitt won, and after a bit of messy engineering, the Bf-110 started to go to operational units in 1938. When the war broke out, the Bf-110 appeared to be doing really well in Poland and Denmark, Norway and France, but in the summer of 1940, the Zerstörer was zerstört by the Hurricanes and Spitfires of the RAF during the Battle of Britain. Lacking the speed and manoeuvrability of the 109 and the ground attack capability that the medium bombers had, the Bf-110 fell between 2 stools in contested airspace. Geschwader were reduced to the ludicrous situation of having to assign Bf-109 escort fighters to the Bf-110 escort fighters to escort the bombers, and so they were withdrawn from battle, at least as far as being a fighter went. These shortcomings had in fact been anticipated by both the RLM and Messerschmitt almost as the Me110 came into production. The rapidly increasing speeds of combat and the realisation that Britain was probably going to be the primary enemy meant a faster, longer-range, more heavily armed aircraft was needed. A revised specification then was issued for an advanced fighter by Udet and the RLM to Arnado, the Junkers subsidiary AGO, and Messerschmitt. It would seem that the word advanced had got all these designers a little bit hot under the collar. AGO put forward something that they called the AO225, of which I can only find overexcited fever dreams drawn by Veribus online, so you're going to have to look at my pretty face for a moment, because those renderings just aren't real. It was classic wacky races Udet stuff, way too advanced and complex, and frankly, really rather bloody silly. Rather than going to put the engines on, the wings, instead it featured an experimental DB606 engine buried in the fuselage, which then, via a complicated set of drive shafts and cranks, ran two props on the wings, which made the ill-fated HE177 look like the very model of simplicity. Arnado put forward the AR240, replete with pressurized cockpit, ducted intakes for the spinners, clever control surfaces, a dividing dive brake a la the Buccaneer, and remote control gun systems. To all of this, Willy Messerschmitt laughed in Reich Flugzeug, and in 1938 began work on the Me210, just as 110 units started to go to the squadrons. The decision to give Willy the order rested with Ernst Udet and the RLM under Hermann Göring, and quite sensibly they decided that first they needed to buy 16 prototypes to kind of iron out any kinks which might be in there. But they also decided, and I note at this point that both were massive drug users, to go full-bore Nazi and simultaneously order a further 1,338 aircraft to be delivered as soon as possible before the bloody thing had even turned an airscrew, and include a provision for a further 700 odd thereafter. Okay, so what actually was the Me210 V1, which would become the A1? Well, let me put on my nerd hat here. It was a low cantilever monoplane with two 1,100 horsepower DB601A engines, a crew of two, and it used a twin-fin tail section similar to that on the BF110. It was 12.2 metres long, or about 40 feet. It had a wingspan of 16.3 metres, that's 53 feet, and it weighed in at 5,300 kilograms before combat loads were added. And no, I can't be asked to convert that to pounds, you can do it yourself. It featured a number of Messerschmitt standards, like, for example, leading-edge slats on the wings and a provision for plenty of nose-mounted cannon. See, I can do serious aviation history too, if only I knew what low cantilever meant. Hang on. Every day's a school day, who knew? Anyway, for the production A1 version, the 210 would feature a pair of forward-firing 20mm MG151 cannon and two 7.9mm MG17 machine guns. All very standard stuff, all very boomy. But rearwards, things got much more interesting. Willy proposed to use a pair of special remote turrets developed by, well, look, I'm going to say they were developed by Rheinmetall, but I know that's not actually true. They were developed by a number of companies you've probably never heard of, and a few parts of government. Can we just call it Rheinmetall and you can look it up yourself? This thing is called an FDL barbette, okay? That's what it is. It's got a single 13mm gun mounted basically on either side of the fuselage, which could move about 45 degrees away from the edge of the aircraft and up and down by about plus minus 75 degrees. But, of course, with that sort of gun mounted there, the opportunity to shoot one's tail off often offends, and so a set of electrical cut-offs were put in to prevent self-deletion from the Luftwaffe's order of battle. These things were fucking complicated. They tried them later on the HE177 and failed, and the Americans used remote gun turrets on the B-29, which took them ages to develop. And if you want an idea of just how challenging this actually is, go and check out Alexander Okay's brilliant video on the subject. You'll find the link below, and you'll see just how difficult it is to make this sort of thing work. In short, you need a lot of clever electrical systems, pulleys, belts, cut-offs, and in this case, a heavy 1.5 horsepower electrical engine to drive all of that, which added a lot of weight and many, many more things that could go wrong. So, if you employ lots of slave labour in, about 1941 onwards to try and build these aircraft, many of those slaves could fuck with your plane very easily and make sure that it would catch fire and crash and kill everybody on board. Slava Ukraini. But we have not yet reached maximum Willy. He'd always had a bit of an ego, but by 1939 it was the size of a planet. For years now, everyone had been telling him just how fucking good he was, and ignoring the many problems with, for example, the undercarriage on the Me109 and the BF108, which would fold up if it was treated even slightly wrong. So when this latter-day Leonardo looked at the 210 schematics he just sold to the RLM, he said, what if I just shocked and surprised people again? I could do something really radical here. So out came the eraser, and the changes began. He shortened the airframe by 90 centimetres, added a bomb bay under the crew, and critically deleted the leading-edge slats, apparently hoping to eliminate some weight and some cost. Satisfied, he stood back without really having discussed this with anybody in the RLM, and ordered the necessary jigs and tooling for the redesign that he just created to cope with the massive order that he just got. And I remind you that as yet, not a single plane has been built, much less flown. Not everybody was happy with the great master's stroke. That should say stroke of genius, yes. Not least was Robert Lusser, Willy's chief designer at the time, who promptly resigned over what Willy was doing. But honestly, chief designers, they're so emotional. Everything's going to be fine, right? Right? In September, in an air of great expectation and anticipation, the first prototype flew, and boy howdy were people shocked and surprised. On landing, the test pilot, one Dr. Hermann Wörster, said, and I quote here, "It lacked longitudinal stability and was unstable in pitch, direction, and yaw." Or put it a different way, it felt like trying to fly a fucking rubber ball bouncing down a corridor. The good doctor recommended extending the body by 1 metre, advice which must have caused a certain amount of discomfort to Willy, the wonder designer. A second flight was arranged with what Willy hoped would be a much more sympathetic pilot, one Fritz Wendel, which proved to be equally disastrous. Wendel, reflecting later, said of the 210 that it featured, and I quote, "all of the least desirable attributes a plane could possibly possess." High praise indeed. It was clear that there was a disaster in the making for the RLM and Willy Messerschmitt. Having forward invested 3 million Reichsmarks in jigs for the Me210, jigs which would be rendered completely useless if he was forced to make the body extension and change the wing shape, Willy chose to plough on and try and fix what he had. Some rapid carpentry later, and the twin tail, similar to that used on the Bf110, was sawn off, and a new single-fin stabiliser was put in its place. Up the plane went again on the 23rd of September. And the good news was that the pilot was no longer fighting for his life every moment of the flight. The bad news was that this gave him time to determine that there were 1 or 2 other hidden treasures within the airframe. It became apparent that the centre of gravity was too far rearward, that the inner wing would and could randomly stall, that the aircraft balance was all over the shop, vortices were forming around the rear of the cockpit, which made all of that much, much worse, with significant lifting surfaces suddenly getting interrupted intermittently in ways that were hard to replicate and test. Worst of all, the shortened body meant lateral control was completely compromised. Or to put that into English, under apparently random circumstances, it would variously flip over or go into a flat spin or suddenly drop out of the sky or, in more than one case, suddenly cartwheel whilst it was in a dive. This was, to say the least, somewhat disconcerting for those on the ground and terminal for those in the air. To add to the fun, sometimes on takeoff or final approach, it would suddenly stall and plough into the ground for no apparent reason, and when taxiing, pilots needed to use a whole load of stick in order to make sure that it didn't veer violently off to the left, a feature that was never even fixed on the Me410. Fortunately, a second prototype, imaginatively named the V2, was built and able to start testing in early October 1939 to see if they could get to the bottom of the problems, which they couldn't. And to add to the party, the new tail now demonstrated what engineers refer to as, quote, tail flutter, or in English, the tail would wobble up and down a lot. In mid-1940, the inevitable happened and the tail was ripped clean off. The aircraft flipped on its back and dived into the ground, rapidly followed by the V2 doing the same thing just a couple of months later. Testing continued into 1941, and by the summer, with the aircraft now almost 2 years behind schedule, Willy was making changes on an almost daily basis to try and solve the plethora of problems, but also create a whole host of new ones, not least of which was crappy undercarriage, which in common with the Bf110, 109 and later 262 was notorious for folding up on landing. It was so bad that in March 1941, Udet wrote to Willy pointing out that the aircraft had once again been delayed by weak undercarriage and that Willy's vonkering was not bloody helping. Units in build would suddenly receive new changes. Armour was suddenly deleted and added, more bomb load was added or taken away, suspension was messed with, and the leading edge slats, which we talked about, were suddenly added back onto the airframe, necessitating a complete redesign of the wing on the fly to aircraft that were already in the production line. Typically, in a production run, you build a few planes, figure out the time and motion kind of stuff and how you do it more quickly and efficiently, and thus, over time, production time and costs go down, and quality generally goes up as the workforce gains experience. If, however, you are making changes like this, everyone is constantly having to guess and relearn everything from scratch every single time. You not just bugger up the production line workforce, but also things that go behind it, things like parts ordering and supporting logistics and all the bits and pieces which make a production line run. Production kept starting and stopping. The Regensburg plant switched onto and off the Me210 no less than 3 times, each requiring total halts, jigs to be moved in and out, inventory built up, and workers trained on whatever the new aircraft will look like now. For weeks at a time, no aircraft at all came off the line at Regensburg as a result. And then things got worse, as somehow one of Willy's tweaks started to cause problems which made the engines eject themselves from their mountings at random intervals in flight. Taken together, the various faults meant that during the testing program, which ran from September of 1939 to the end of 1942, no less than 11 prototypes were written off, 5 pilots were killed, and another 16 airframes were very badly damaged. So, with so much money and prestige wrapped up into the project, failure was not an option. And despite these interesting design characteristics. The first aircraft were produced, labelled the Me210A0, and went into limited production, as was in November of 1941, so that at least operational units could begin trials. This was perhaps not a coincidence that on the 17th of that month, Ernst Udet suffered a terminal lead poisoning incident from a 9x19 Parabellum to the brain. In March of 1942, Erhard Milch, who'd taken over from Ernst Udet, finally mercifully cancelled the Me210 project. Amongst the reasons listed for this unprecedented step were the tendency to veer off the runway on takeoff, dangerous spin characteristic problems, with both hydraulic and electric systems failing on a regular basis, bombs that wouldn't release unless the aircraft was in a 30-degree dive, the complete failure of the remote turrets to really work and keep firing. They jammed the whole time, assuming the electrics worked in the first place, which often they didn't, and a lack of any kind of large-scale testing after all this time, effort, energy, and money had been put into the project. With Willy being ridden like a sailor on shore leave to produce the aircraft, he blamed all of these problems on the RLM. And Milch blamed Willy, and Goering blamed them both and took potshots at his own pilots to boot, calling them lousy when they crashed. In April of 1942, all production aircraft in build were pulled off the line, and over 100 of them were made ready to be broken up with Axis. This was too much for Goering. The Reichsmarschall finally threw his toys out of the pram, and a gleeful Milch was ordered to remove Willy from the board of Messerschmitt. So far, the company had lost 38 million Reichsmarks to this point, just on jigs and tooling, and Milch was on the line to lose another 30 million, which he was going to try and claim back from the organisation as compensation. It was actually worse than this because Messerschmitt was not the only manufacturer of the Me210. As part of a complex arm deals with Hungary, a SOP to try and keep them in the war, Goering had negotiated to allow a company called Weiss Manfred, known as WM, in Hungary to manufacture not just DB601 and 605 engines, but basically also as many Me210s as they could. And the deal was that for every 3 aircraft they produced, they would send 2 to Germany and keep 1 for themselves, and the bill would be footed by the Reich. The Hungarian government urgently wanted more aircraft, so they put every resource that they could into this project. Realpolitik now entered into the fray to make life infinitely worse for the RLM. Hitler knew that Hungary was, at best, an opportunist member of the Axis. It had an expansionist government run by royalists and nationalists who had designs on territory in Slovakia, Czechoslovakia and Romania.
Sorry, this is post-production Hardthrasher here. Unfortunately, what just happened there was I said Czechoslovakia and Slovakia, which would be the same place at different points in time. What I meant was Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia. So there you are. All right, thank you. Bye-bye. But the population actually was incredibly apathetic. It couldn't give 2 shits about these goals, and actually more than a few of them wanted to merge with the Soviet Union. Germany needed Hungary in the war, not sitting in the sidelines where either the Soviets or Allied forces might use it as a means to strike at Germany's flank. They therefore decided to reduce the number of now useless aircraft being delivered to them, but they couldn't turn the whole thing off as the risk of political fallout by cancelling it was so much that they had to allow the Royal Hungarian Air Force, very generously, to take a greater proportion of the output, whilst still footing the bill for aircraft that they didn't want. It wasn't until March 1944, when the Wehrmacht invaded Hungary, that the WM line was finally shut down, by which point they had produced several hundred essentially useless aircraft. The Hungarians themselves did in fact quite like the Me210, at least compared to the alternative aircraft that they had. But when one considers that the aircraft that they had was the open cockpit CR-42 biplane, it's hardly surprising to see why they might think the Me210 was at least an upgrade. Back in May 1942, though, chaos was reigning in Augsburg. Workers began to break up the 100 Me210s in various states of production just in time to be told to stop, as there were some new changes coming down the line, which meant that the airframes might be salvaged, just as the lucky men of the Luftwaffe started to get deliveries of this exciting new Wunderwaffen. First up was the wonderfully named Schnellkampfgeschwader 210, or more parochially, 16 kg2. Training was intensive. The idea here was to go and hit Britain. Finally, the perfidious Englanders would face the mighty Luftwaffe 2 years after the humiliation of the Battle of Britain and see what this glorious, unstoppable revenge weapon could do. Except that's not quite how it went. 16 kg2, short of experienced pilots, could only launch the occasional nuisance raid at Britain, the first of which went off on the 9th of August and was promptly shot down over the channel by Typhoons of 262 Squadron, who then added 2 more Me210s to their tallies on the 13th and 14th of August as the Dieppe raid was going on.
16 KG2 was, by now, seriously in trouble, having lost a number of machines and pilots thanks to the 210 itself. So when 2 more 210s were shot down, this time by No. 1 Typhoons on the 6th of September, this mighty offensive came to a complete halt. 16 KG2 stopped its operations and was recalled back to Germany. So that had gone well. Better luck, it was hoped, might be found in North Africa, flying as escorts across the Med for Hitler's bonkers plan to reinforce Tunisia. In November, the unit transferred to Sicily, and in just 1 month, 18 aircraft and 13 aircrew were killed. Although, to be honest, by this point, the North African theatre was going about as badly as it could for the Axis, and the Me210 could have been a superweapon, it would still have got a shoeing. As the front collapsed over the following months, the Allied air forces hammered Luftwaffe transports and their escorts as they flew men and material in and out of the shrinking Axis pocket, resulting in the destruction of not just more than 60 Me210s, but almost the entire remaining stock of Ju-52s and the giant Me323s on Luftwaffe books. Luftwaffe transport capability, which had never really recovered after the disasters in Norway back in 1940 and had been further eroded by operations over Crete and Stalingrad, was effectively ended for the rest of the war. Kills on Me210s were made by P.78 Lightnings, RAF Spitfires, and embarrassingly by more than one B-17 and B-26, but fully 1/3 of the losses were as a result of accidents and crashes. In returns for dozens of aircraft lost, they claimed 2 RAF Spitfires and no bombers at all. By the 13th of May 1943, General Sir Harold Alexander, who regular viewers will know from his time in Burma, sent the following telegram to London saying, "Sir, it is my duty to report that the Tunisian campaign is over. All enemy resistance has ceased. We are masters of the North African shores." All right. Fine. We've established that so far the Me210 has managed to lose against Britain, it's managed to lose over Europe, it's managed to lose in North Africa, it's managed to lose in Italy. What about the other front? You know, the one which at least Stalin thought was where the war was won, the Eastern Front. How did the Me210 fare there? I'm so glad you asked. The problem with the Eastern Front was it is notorious for being incredibly hot in summer and incredibly cold in winter, and an unreliable aircraft in that environment is never going to thrive. Essentially, they came, they saw, they froze their air screws off, and they went home. The Germans did send some evaluation units out to the front, and it didn't really go terribly well. The Hungarians operated, of course, a number of Me210s for an extended period of time. And let me just quickly check their casualty figures here. Yes, they took 98% losses. So basically, it didn't go terribly well at all. This was not a huge shock to anybody that was involved with the design of the Me210. There were more variants on the basic design than there were entries in the Berlin telephone directory by this point. But you know what they say, 17th time's the charm. Well, at least that's what they said in November of 1942 back in Regensburg. The Me210 V17, that is prototype 17 for those who are keeping count, had a lengthened body at last, now 95 centimetres longer, had less sweep in the wings, a change in the engine nacelles, a widened body behind the cockpit to try and eliminate some of that weird airflow and stall stuff, and featured leading edge slats again. By this point, no one wanted to fly something called the Me210, so a rebrand was in urgent need. This isn't, of course, an Me210 with a few tweaks, they said. No, Lord, no, this is a totally different aircraft called, it's called the Me410. Yeah, 410. Yeah. Oh, and it's, did we tell you, it's got a really cool name now. Das Hornes, or the Hornet. That'll show the Catholic, Masonic, Judeo-Capitalist, Bolshevik, homosexual Jehovah's Witnesses who's boss. Hell yeah. Because it was, in fact, just an upgraded Me210A0, of which there were quite a few now just sitting around on production lines gathering dust, starting 410 production was pretty quick. In December of 1942, the first Me410s, now featuring DB603 engines, were delivered to a new testing squadron, Einsprungsstaffel 410 at Lechfeld, and it was found to be, well, not shit. It still occasionally stalled, and it still wanted to wander off and inspect the passing scenery on takeoff, but it no longer disassembled spontaneously in the sky, or at least not as often. With what they thought was light at the end of the tunnel, the RLM now called for 1,128 410s to be produced by 1943. Sure, guys, sure. In point of fact, even including the Hungarian machines and the prototypes and the 210s on the production line which they could rework, and 210s out with squadrons that they could rework, the total number that was ever produced was never more than 1,000 or so. About 400 Me210s in various stages of completion were converted to the 410 spec pretty quickly, but the remaining 800 took from May 1943 to August 1944 to be built, and at least 200 of those never got to the frontline squadrons. But even if you take the top line figure, roughly that's less than 2 per day being produced. And I will remind viewers that Willow Run at this point was turning out a B-24 every 63 minutes, and that de Havilland in England, who was doing this with bits of wood, was churning out a Mosquito every 6 hours, never mind overseas production, which doubled it again. Given what Hans Jassenek, before he killed himself, called the apparent black hole of new aircraft development, a plane that was just 3.5 years later than planned, in a different form than was planned, with loads of dead aircrew and a massive amount of wasted resources like the 410, basically meant that it was on time and to budget by Nazi standards, and there were high hopes that it might prove to be actually useful. These hopes were rapidly dashed. Had the Me410 been ready in 1940, there is no question it would have been a radical aircraft, far ahead of anything that the Allies had. But by 1943, it was essentially obsolete as a daylight operator. Initially, the plan was to try and use the Me410 to take on the increasing numbers of B-17s in raids coming over Germany in the last part of 1943 and into the first part of 1944. But the DB603 engines really didn't like altitude very much, making the plane slow high up. It was, of course, still a twin-engine fighter, and in a straight fight against the P-51 or P-47s, it was toast because twin-engine fighters against single-engine fighters don't work. Naturally, the Luftwaffe, having a penchant for massive fuck-off guns, tried strapping a variety of anti-bomber weapons to it as quickly as they could to see if they could improve their kill rate. For example, in a move that would make Albonia's leader El Jefe weep for joy, they rolled out the 15cm Nebelwerfer 41, popped a few tubes under each of the 410's wings, and off they went. Normally, the Nebelwerfer 41 was used on the ground as an indirect fire, multi-shot rocket system, giving it the accuracy of a drunk taking a piss up against a wall. So, whilst when a warhead made contact they were really impressively destructive, it was a 40-kilogram charge after all. Getting close enough to get that hit to a B-17 made sure that you were going to get killed by the B-17's gunners. But they didn't stop there. In an encounter related by Albert Speer in his mendacious autobiography, the Führer, well known as an aviation genius, enraged by yet another report of bombing of his blessed country, insisted that an aircraft be fitted with a giant, long-range gun which could sit well outside the range of the B-17s and blow them out of the sky at a distance. Rather than pointing out that the sky was filled with thousands of nimble single-engine fighters like the P-47 and P-51 who'd kill anything that slow and obvious, the OKL High Command saluted and said, "Brilliant stuff, mein Führer! I can't believe we didn't consider that! Gosh, you're so right! We'll get right on it!" Consequently, a number of Me210s were equipped with the 50mm BK5 cannon, originally seen on the Panzer III. This was a weapon that weighed 1,600 kilograms, had a barrel over 4 meters long, and supposedly had a recoil of about 7 tons. When it made contact, it was really impressive, but the weight of the bloody great big barrel rendered the 410 as nimble as a sumo wrestler in a tar pit. After these lumbering aircraft either failed to intercept the bomber stream at all or were simply blown out of the sky to little effect by the attackers, they tried again with a more modest 37mm BK-37. You know, the one that they put on the Ju-87 Stuka that Veribus called the can opener. Yep, that one. It was capable of 160 rounds a minute. I mean, it had a magazine of, of 12. Yeah. Actually, that might sound like a problem, but it really wasn't, because this thing jammed so fucking often that pilots were lucky to get 1 or 2 rounds off before it stopped working. So, that was good. By November of 1944, the Luftwaffe had essentially been defeated, and the few surviving Me-410s were withdrawn from anti-bomber work. Better luck, it was hoped, might be had by trying to fly night intruder operations over Britain to shoot down returning bombers as they went back to their airfields in England under the cover of darkness. From July of 1943 to December 1944, Me-410s flew missions over the UK, but it did not go at all well for the intruders. RAF Mozzies, with their own onboard air intercept radars and supported by a sophisticated ground network, went through these 410s like a hot knife through butter, shooting down 60 of them and damaging 20 more for no Mosquito losses and very few RAF bomber losses. Ironically, the only really successful night that the 410 intruders had was on the 22nd of April 1944, when they managed to catch a formation of United States Army Air Force B-24s making a rare nighttime landing. Relaxed and assuming that they were nearly home, the B-24s were caught unawares and no less than 14 were lost, either to 410s, to ground fire, or to one another in the confusion. A last hurrah of the Me-410s came under the grandly named Operation Steinbock, better known as the Baby Blitz in Britain, which brought together the 2 worst aircraft ever produced, the HE-177 as the bomber and the Me-410 as the fighter, in a crescendo of incompetence and failure. Between January the 21st, 1944 and the middle of May 1944, the Luftwaffe attempted revenge raids over UK airspace with predictably terrible results. Starting with over 500 aircraft in January, by May the operation was cancelled after they'd suffered 70% casualties, including 27 Me410s, and achieved twat all in return. Some Me410s held recon roles into 1945, but the reality was that the Me410 had just come far too late to be of any service. We started all of this by saying that the Me210 achieved the holy trinity of crapness: a failed concept, failed engineering, and failed politics. But actually what makes this aircraft really stand out is not just that it had all of that, which it did, but it was, in fact, totally pointless from the start because there were already other aircraft in the Nazi kitbag that could do this job just fine. I mean, think about it. The original idea here was for a twin-engined, long-range bomber escort, but by the time the 410 turned up, the Reich was going firmly backwards, and any thought of strategic bombing was really out of the window, so that idea was dead. You might want a heavy fighter to shoot down daylight bombers, but as we've seen, all this did was to give the USAAF fighters easy kills, so that idea was dead. A twin-engine aircraft capable of lifting Schauster music, that's the upwardly firing cannon, air intercept radar and an extra crew member to operate it, and having decent endurance was really useful at night against the RAF. But since speed didn't particularly matter, the Bf-110 did that job extremely well to the end of the war, so the 210 and 410 were just more complicated and expensive answers to a problem that they'd already solved. If you wanted a super-fast recon plane as an alternative, or something to go and try and chase down daylight Mosquito raiders, or come to that as a tactical dive bomber and transport escort, well, the Ju-88 was right fucking there. Stick some nitros in the engines of those puppies and the Ju-88 could fucking shift. It had loads of guns, it could dive bomb just fine, and it liked flying at altitude. In a sensible, rational world, you would have seen the Me210 shut down much earlier than it was, the Bf-110 and Ju-88 production ramped up as an alternative. But the Nazi state was neither rational nor stable. It was a collection of frightened racists haunted by losing a war so much that they felt that their only recourse was to murder millions of people. For politics as much as anything else, the Me210 was allowed to continue killing crews as it went on, wasting vast resources for the Nazi state that it could ill afford to lose, until eventually Germany lost the war and Göring died in Spandau. And frankly, good riddance to all of them.